We recently ran a Cinema EOS workshop at the Snow Centre here in Hemel Hempstead, and on our lunch break decided to stop for a quick on-camera chat with Ollie Kenchington about the new generation of Canon Cinema EOS. So, Ollie, we've had this chat a few times over the last couple of years about why you use Canon. If anyone's been watching this channel over the last few years, they've definitely seen it, but I thought it would be interesting to revisit, mainly because Canon, since we last had the chat, Canon have pretty much replaced their entire Cinema EOS line. We've got the C500 Mark II, C300, C70, even the R5 and R6 have come out since we last had the chat. So where are you at nowadays with Canon? What are you using?
So when we would have last spoken about this, I would have been still using the C200.
Sure.
I used that as my main camera for about 2 years or more. Sure. I then got my hands on the C300 Mark III last April and just fell in love with it. I mean, it's an incredible camera, so capable in so many different ways, but the sensor particularly just blew me away. For me particularly, a lot of the stuff I do, even though it's corporate, it's very much in that kind of brand documentary sphere, so there's a lot of documentary technique and style that I use in my corporate and commercial work. And so that kind of extends often into the lighting. So although I use light panels, Geminis, and we often will light interviews in a fairly stylized, quite dynamic way. Often with B-roll, it's completely hands-off in terms of lighting. I like to approach most of that stuff in a fairly naturalistic way.
Sure.
And the 16 plus stops of dynamic range that we've got with the sensor from the C300 Mark III allows you to alter your approach to lighting. You can be far more natural with it. You can allow things to just kind of reflect and bounce light, even strong sunlight, in a way that you just couldn't really.
So Canon introduced the DGO sensor with the C300 Mark III. How much of this expanded dynamic range and how much of what you liked about the new sensor do you attribute to that DGO technology? Has it made a big difference?
Yeah, absolutely. I almost solely attribute it to that technology. I mean, the look and feel of it is very reminiscent of the Alexas, the Miras, the way that Arri also used this DGO technology. And
similar idea.
The look just feels more, it's just more subtle. It's got that slight, it sounds like the wrong term to use, but almost haziness in the highlights,
right, yes.
Which you would typically use something like a Pro Mist filter or something to take that edge off of a more video-looking kind of camera. It doesn't have that. The look of it is far more natural. The way that it approaches and handles highlights is just gorgeous. It's a really unique and special quality that the C300 Mark III sensor has. So that absolutely changed things for me in a big way, and I 100% intended on chopping my C200 in for the C300 Mark III as soon as I could. And at more or less the same time that I almost had enough money put aside in the September of last year, Canon then throw a wild card into the mix and send me the C70. The C70 came out with me for just a few days in that September. It was one of the last kind of sunny days we had last year before winter really took hold, and it was just such a lovely experience, and it really solidified for me that it was that sensor for me that was so special about the C300 Mark III. Specifically used that camera for certain jobs where we've needed that. But from a day-to-day perspective, bearing in mind I shot most of what I shot with the C200 in MP4.
Sure.
And
by yourself, really, for the most part, small crews.
Because you can, if you really understand how to get the most out of that camera, or any camera, I think you really can get away with those types of codecs. Surely it's lovely to have bigger, more robust codecs, but I made it work quite happily. So the RAW was only really something if the workflow particularly dictated it, which it often didn't, and there were big considerations in terms of cost of media. Now a lot of that kind of went away, moving to CF Express, but still for me, I had to readdress when the C70 came along. I had to think, do I really need that RAW for every single job? So I took the money that I'd set aside for the C300 Mark III and just made the kind of business decision to invest that into a C70. And with the extra to kind of flesh out my RF lens range that I had already started building up. And I'm now using the C70 as a kind of main camera, often pairing it with an R5 as a B cam for interviews. And I'm just thrilled with it as a camera, as a kind of a one size fits all. It does everything. It's got that sensor that I was just talking about that I think is what makes the big difference for me. 120 frames, 4K, very high quality, slow motion. Is good for flexibility for some of the B-roll.
Great for corporate things. You so often in a corporate world, you're trying to make something that is effectively quite mundane seem beautiful and seem larger than life.
Yeah.
And slow-mo, you don't have to go all the way to 100 frames most of the time, but having access to great slow-mo like that really, really helps.
Yes, although I think you have to be really careful with it.
Of course.
I certainly try and avoid overusing it. What I tend to do with B-roll is shoot it all at 50 frames, unconformed, so you've got those frames if you want them, but if you don't, you don't need them. But with the 120 frames, it conforms it to 25p in the camera, so you have slow motion there within the file. And so I tend to want to use that with specific things where, well, for example, I did a shoot for the RHS, who are one of my clients, a couple of months ago, and where we were shooting there was a beehive. Some nice 120 frames per second footage of the bees coming in and out of the hive. Perfect example. I think when it justifies it, it's just nice to have it there, and particularly nice that there's no hidden image quality. Because I'd use other cameras which had higher frame rates in the past, but you had to go into it like, this is going to...
It's such a double whammy, that, because when everything's in slow-mo, you have more time to appreciate the lower image quality. It's a real double-edged sword sometimes.
I mean, I don't know what data rate Canon are allocating to that 120, but it certainly just looks casually to my eye to be every bit as good and as high quality as
the real time.
Whether you're shooting at 25 or 50. So, it does make a difference. And it's just a very flexible camera. I mean, and not least because of its size and weight. I shoot a lot handheld. Although actually on mine I've taken off the hand grip and I've got a bright tangerine left field cage on there,
great
top
cage.
handle. It's got NATO rails on the top and side, so I have additional side grips and various. I built it up in various ways, mat box and rails and bits and pieces, and that works for me as an incredibly flexible package. I can take it all out of that and stick it straight onto the DJI RS2 if I want to get gimbal stuff. So that size and weight is also making a big difference.
I think it's a big thing when coming from cameras like the C200, because the C200 is much more akin with the C300 Mark III in terms of its ergonomics, whereas this is not just different from that, but also something that is a little bit different really for the whole industry.
It's a law unto itself, absolutely.
Exactly.
It's completely novel, and I freely admit when I first got it out of the box, when Canon first sent it to me, I think I exclaimed out loud, "What the hell is that?"
I think I actually started my C70 video by saying I don't think it's the prettiest camera in the world.
No, I mean it's definitely grown on me, but when I first saw it I was like, what were they thinking? And then you instantly, I mean it was as quick as getting it out of the box, I was like, you feel it in the hand, and the inclusion of the top handle. I mean it's a camera that's designed to be moved handheld, integrated into workflows and setups where you're moving the camera a lot, and for me that's perfect because we do that a lot because, as you quite rightly pointed out, corporates aren't always the most interesting subject matter.
You don't have a crew of 20 people around either.
Absolutely,
They talked about a lot when they first launched it about it being this hybrid approach between stills and sort of video cameras like the C200 and C300 Mark III. How do you think that has translated into real world use? Are you using it as a bit of a new thing, or are you just effectively using it in the same way as you were the bigger cameras?
I've always liked shooting handheld, but there's a certain time where it hurts, you know? And because this weighs so little, I'm doing it more, and the digital image stabilization system that they've got in all of their Cinema EOS range now is so good. I mean, there's shots I've got which have just been handheld that you would swear blind were caught with a slider or something like that, you know.
Sure.
So again, there's so many more reasons to have it in the hand now, not just because of the ergonomics, but also because of the technology inside, the autofocus. I can be a little bit more cavalier with the way that I'm using it, but knowing I'll still be able to lock on to a subject. So I'm definitely using it in a different way, but probably the most tangible example of that is now how quickly I can go from on my tripod to the gimbal. You know, with the C200, I tried to get it on a gimbal, and as in a handheld
Sure.
single gimbal, and it just impossible, and I ran into issues with cabling and this, I take the top handle off, I slide it on,
Super easy.
and you're there,
Yep.
and it now, the gimbal now comes out with me more often, and I'm using it to kind of introduce more movement into the B-roll that I would definitely not have been able to do with the C200. So it has changed, and again, you need to be wary of repeating shots and it looking too formulaic, but I think definitely there's more opportunity now with this camera for me to be able to explore how the camera might move through a scene and use parallax to lend more of a sense of depth to the scene, which is great. And again, this that RHS job that I talked about a moment ago with the high frame rate Bs, we're capturing a two-person interview, then a load of B-roll, and then some walk and talks with one of the presenters. And so we were sticks, gimbal for the walk and talk, handheld for the B-roll. We shot the whole thing. We had only about 2 hours at this location. It was for the RHS's Virtual Chelsea that they did earlier this year. And one of the ladies who was presenting, a lady called Aaron Anderson, who's also a Gardeners World presenter, and she said, well, it's funny, I've been to this garden with Gardeners World crew, and there was tons of them,
Yep.
huge crew. We were here for a whole day to produce a 6-minute segment for Gardeners World. So it's quite odd that I'm back here working with you. You're on your own. It's just me and a soundy, that was it.
Yep.
And I shot the whole thing on the C70 and an R. I think it was actually my EOS R as the B cam for one of the interviews, and for the second angle. And she said, if I hadn't have been with you and seen you producing this whole thing in a fraction of the time with a fraction of the crew,
You would have thought it was done by the bigger
I would have
crew.
assumed it was the same thing. And she, bless her, she actually rang me after that went out, because she never saw the edit. She actually rang me and said, I've shown this to people at BBC, and they're like blown away. They're absolutely blown away. They said it's too good for online. But it was a bit of a
funny compliment.
Isn't it? But for someone that works in broadcast, I think she absolutely met that as a huge compliment. So,
Sure.
I think that perfectly illustrates in that one job how much more flexibility you have in terms of the camera, size of crew. But to be honest, I think, if we hold our hands up, over the last 2 years, there has been a squeeze, and I've had people like, well, we can either not do it, or we can do it with this budget,
money.
and you can try and make it work. And
Yep.
you have to be able to react to that and respond to that. And slowly bigger things are coming along and working on the more kind of traditional commercial stuff that we've done in the past.
Sure.
But certainly over the last 18 months, I've had to be able to shoot stuff with really small crews or just on my own, but maintain the same quality. And
Well, I
that's
think
helped.
that is the key thing with the C70, isn't it? And that hybrid approach is it gives you the flexibility of the smaller cameras while keeping a lot of what makes the
Yeah.
final footage great
Yeah.
from the bigger cameras.
Yeah. There's no way you could maintain that quality without, for example, professional XLR inputs with the built-in NDs. That's a much, even simple things like that become a very difficult thing to manage and still capture high quality creative content.
So are there situations where you find that you do still want to use the bigger cameras like the C300 Mark III and C500 Mark II?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, in fact, there was a project that we shot earlier in the summer, which, for various reasons I won't go into now, we decided that the aesthetic that we wanted was with Sumire. We
Right.
shot main cam with C500 Mark II with the Sumire on it, and in fact, actually used the C70 as a B cam with I think it was the Metabones RF to PL adapter, and had the Sumires on that camera as well as the B angle. So that was just an aesthetic choice. We wanted that full frame look, and we wanted the Sumire look as well. I've also shot things where we've specifically got in the C300 Mark III, did a project for the Wild Beer Co, who are one of our clients, where we needed to show off ingredients. We're using colour, quite vivid RGB LEDs, but also the subject that we were shooting, and the colour workflow needed to be raw for that particular
Right.
project, but we also wanted to shoot 120 frames.
Right.
So
yes.
C300 Mark III.
Yeah.
So that definitely there's still lots of occasions where we're going to need those cameras, and they're just great and easy things to bring in and mix in with what we've got. So yeah, there's lots of times where we are still using those bigger cameras, bringing them in and integrating them with either the C70 or even the mirrorless cameras. And you've still got underpinning all of those cameras, you've still got that continuity that comes through things like the neutral color matrix, just the rock solid color science behind these cameras, the way that it can accurately capture colors, interpret them to my mind correctly, you know.
So with this new generation compared to the previous generation, so C300 Mark II, C200, we all know those cameras and we know that those were great cameras. You know, the image, we've had conversations which have sounded very similar to this about those cameras. Can you speak a little bit about the difference between this new generation? How big a difference have you seen?
There's two key things for me. There's the ability of the newer generation cameras to look the same as each other.
Right.
So there's a particular look when you're in the standard default neutral color matrix, assuming you've white balanced the camera correctly, that you will achieve whatever you're using, whether it's the C300 Mark III or C500 Mark II. They're all using, all the mirrorless cameras, they're using this color matrix to kind of make them so they all work and look exactly the same. And to the point where, you know, I regularly shoot with the R5 as a B cam to this, and when you're cutting between the two, and I'm grading them, I mean, there's almost nothing to do. Now, the other thing is the ability of the camera's, you know, imaging pipeline to capture colors and place them in specific places. So if you think about, you know, we use the color charts an awful lot. If you think about the chromaticity coordinates for your primary and secondaries in a Rec 709 system, they are very specifically plotted on a vector scope, and a calibrated video system will place those primaries and secondaries in those boxes on the vector scope. That's always been my benchmark for testing cameras, and the Canons have always been very good at placing them. And I've done with you know, live workshops where we've captured with the C200, for example, we've captured those charts and we've shown the vector scope and look how close they all are. But there's normally a little bit of wiggle room just to completely align them where they should be. With each generation, what I'm finding is that little bit of wiggling, which admittedly is probably more than even most people would do, but that little bit of wiggling is getting less and less. And the C300 Mark III, when I tested it, the references, those chromaticity references, were falling slap bang where they should be. So there's a generational improvement there in terms of color accuracy.
It's funny, isn't it? Because as a colorist, I'm sure people out there might think, well, you can make any camera look good nowadays. But that's sort of missing the point somehow, isn't it? I mean, how easy it is to achieve that neutral color palette in the first place is an important part of choosing the camera.
So if everything is correctly balanced, technically balanced, and as close to that as you get that stuff in, it means that you don't have to do too much work to get the continuity in, which is a huge part of color grading, that continuity from shot to shot. You know, is that object still white in the next shot as it was in the previous one? And that's much easier to achieve if you've got a camera, obviously, that's getting you there much quicker. And from that point, you can then jump off to go into the creative look, if you want to apply a film look, or if you're trying to, you know, make the viewer feel a certain way and introducing certain colours or whatever it might be. Or maybe your colour palette and your look is established in wardrobe and set design, which is the way that it should be done, you know? Not just, oh, I'll just drop that LUT on and now I've got my colour palette, you know? So, or both working together ideally. So, you know, you still need that technical underpinning. And if you don't have that there, then you're wasting a lot of your time creatively kind of subdued whilst you essentially take that creative hat off and just work on tints and, you know, correction. And, you know, I want to use as much of my time as possible for creating an image that's rich, that's deep, that, you know, invites people in to kind of really explore the frame and get sort of enveloped by what's in front of them, not using all of my time just to get rid of noise and to, you know, make sure that those two cameras look the same as you cut between them. And that's what I found with other camera systems, which I don't find with Canon. That consistency across the camera range. I can shoot multicam, or if it's single camera, I can get very good, accurate results straight out of the camera.
I mean, that's the thing, we've seen several generations of cameras now in the time since you moved to Canon. What is it that's keeping you back? Is that the main factor?
That's the main factor. There's also just the ease of use. You know, I had a little play, don't tell Canon, I had a little play with a competitor's camera the other day, and a good chat.
There are a few.
There are. And a good chat with the person who owned said camera. And And it's obvious that I think people have moved on. They've come further, but they're moving towards where Canon have been forever.
Sure.
It's like there's that element of trust with Canon that I can pick up one of their cameras and I don't have to think, is this the time it's going to bite me on the bum where it's like it's going to get thrown off? It's absolute reliability, and I can just switch off any kind of fears and just focus on the job at hand. And I missed that. The time when I haven't been shooting Canon, when I come back to Canon, that kind of relief, that kind of weight off your shoulders of just, I can just pick this up and shoot and it's going to look good. It allows you to redivert your creative energy, and that's really important, I think, for the best results.